It's time for the Wednesday edition of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Ray Fittipaldo on, and we're talking about the Steelers quarterback situation. Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, who will be the quarterback leading the Steelers next season? We talk about what Mike Tomlin said, as well as the situation around George Pickens and Arthur Smith, all here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Ray Fittipaldo, one of our great Steelers beat writers. And as always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily episodes daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, you can find this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injury victims for over 40 years, recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a free unless they get money for you. Ray, you and I kind of touched on it. We left the quarterback situation alone for our Monday episode because we had so much other things to talk about coaching staff and changes and what needs to happen there. But when it comes to the quarterback position, the Steelers have a tough point. As Mike Tomlin pointed out, the Steelers don't have a quarterback under contract for next season, which is kind of familiar from them lately, considering how when they traded away Kenny Pickett, what that situation led them to, and at the end of Ben Roethlisberger's tenure. So now they have a situation to choose where they could go. Now, Mike Tomlin did say during his press conference that Justin Fields had shown enough in his first 6 games that he could be a starter for the Steelers in 2025, but he wouldn't commit to him or Russell Wilson or anyone for that matter. Where do you see the likelihood of this situation going as far as who the Steelers might want to keep for their quarterback for the future?
Yeah, I think people are kind of reading into what Mike said yesterday, and I think we have to be careful with that because he also brought up, we have to see what's out there in free agency, and we have to see who's in the draft. But I think, I would be shocked, Chris, if it's not Justin Fields or Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
And, thinking back, even a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I thought it was a slam dunk that Wilson would be back. But the offense finished so poorly. Wilson was up and down, didn't really do anything to elevate the offense, especially early in games. Over those final 5 games. So to me, it's a big question mark now. And I think, Fields is maybe even play more now than I thought he would be. And I asked Mike yesterday about the quarterback mobility factor. You just look around the playoffs, Chris, and, Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen,
Jalen Hurts.
All those guys can help your offense when your offensive line breaks down. And look at the Steelers' offensive line. It wasn't playing well at the end of the season, but if you have a mobile quarterback, that can negate that a little bit. So we saw the same thing with Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold probably more similar to Russ than any of these other guys, and I thought he was exposed as well. So, there was a reason Mike went to Russell Wilson, but I just looking back on it and the way things ended, I do think they're going to have those discussions here in the next couple of days and weeks about what the best option is going forward.
And here's the other thing. The Steelers want to have a really good offensive line. And when you have a really good offensive line and a mobile quarterback, it makes for an even more dangerous attack, like the Philadelphia Eagles, who are working with maybe the best offensive line of football, and Jalen Hurts, who can move. So I think that there's certainly room for the Steelers to make that move. And like you said, Russell Wilson, like the reason he was brought in wasn't because Justin Fields stunk, but it was because Justin Fields wasn't able to unlock different parts of the offense the way that for the first 2 months Russell Wilson did. You saw, no Steelers receiver had a touchdown when Justin Fields, outside of Calvin Austin, but like George Pickens wasn't being involved enough as much. A lot of the Steelers games that they were winning with Justin Fields, they weren't throwing up the kind of points that you wanted to throw up, that you felt like that we're getting there. And then Russell Wilson comes in and they average like 5 more points per game when he starts in his first 2 months. They were averaging over 28 points per game in his first 2 months of play, including that Bengals game, including that Commanders game, and the Commanders win and Ravens win that Russell Wilson led still could look to be like some of the best wins, and the Bengals win, they look like the best wins the Steelers had this season. But then you have to factor in also the way that the season ended was that when teams started to adjust to what Russell Wilson was doing and that the Steelers didn't have an effective ground game, it kind of limited the offense. And so now you have to ask yourself, okay, is tying yourself to Russell Wilson the move here? When teams can kind of scheme that up, if you don't develop an offensive line, you're going to be right back where you were the last 5 games of the season. Or do you go back? Right? Do you try again with Justin Fields, knowing that, hey, this guy can at least give you the mobility. He can hit on the passes, and you can try to develop him and how much he understands your offense. I think the other factor here, Ray, though, is the pay. Because when you're looking at this and this roster still has a lot of things to improve. Like I even think they could use some additions on their offensive line, defense, wide receiver, running back. They need to to put some capital towards those places. And if you're spending $30 million a year on a quarterback who's not the straw that stirs the drink, that could be a problem. So I think that's another factor that goes into Wilson or Fields and which one that they got to choose.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, I go back to, the way the Steelers manufactured yards and points when Justin was the quarterback. And it didn't always look pretty, but he did find ways to win football games. And he didn't always do that in Chicago. But, Chris, the more I think about this, whether it's Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, I really think, and I don't know if they can accomplish this offseason because the draft really isn't known to have a lot of great quarterbacks, but you have to get a young guy in here to develop. There's just no there's really a lot among the fan base. There's not a lot of confidence going forward when you don't have that potential franchise quarterback that can uplift your entire team. I think we both realize that Justin Fields and Russell Wilson aren't going to be that long-term answer. So, Andy Weidel got Jalen Hurts, in the second round of the 2020 draft. Maybe there's a diamond in the rough this year that they can go out there and start to develop. If it doesn't happen this year, maybe the 2026 quarterback crop is a little bit better, and that's when you really devote all your time and resources to getting that guy. So, I don't want to cast doom on the 2025 season already, but I just want to point out that whether it was Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, this offense still finished 23rd in the league in total yards. And after being a top 10 scoring offense, probably 6 weeks ago, they finished 16th. So middle of the pack or worse in pretty much every statistical category. And I don't even want to bring up like the red zone offense and all these other metrics. I mean, they were probably 31st, 32nd in some of those. So it was not good by the end of the season. And to me, that's the first thing you got to figure out, both for 2025, the present, and going forward. I think even the future is more important because you got to try to find a way to get that guy in place sooner rather than later.
No, I agree. When you look at what the Steelers kind of went through offensively, like, look, getting to the middle of the pack was a step up for the Steelers, considering they had been like in the bottom 5 of the league for like the past 3 years. But when you saw that there was a potential for you to be in the top 10 and you finished the way that you did, that is disappointing. So I think that's where they're looking at his quarterback, who can best lead the offense in the way that's going to be most effective with what they're working on right now. And also what other investments can you make in the offense around the type of quarterback that you pick? Like if you pick Russell Wilson, you better make sure that offensive line isn't just decent next year, but very good. Like Troy Fautano is going to need to come in breathing hot fire. Broderick Jones is going to need to be so much better than he was this past year. Zach Frazier, Mason McCormick, and if they keep Isaac Seumalo, maybe they go get another guard to start. Those type of situations. If they don't have that, Russell Wilson is going to be very much looking like what he did at the end of last season. Whereas, like you said, Justin Fields could be the guy that's buying you time, giving you opportunities to win until you figure out that offensive line.
Yeah, and I don't know. Can you count on Broderick Jones getting better? I don't know. I think the jury is very much out on his development. This is a huge year, huge offseason coming up for him. I have faith that Troy Fautanu, will pan out, if he is As long as injuries don't play a part there. I think Zach Frazier is really solid. But, yeah, you got to figure out the guards, Chris. Sam Waller last year, his deal, I thought average at best season, and he's 31, 32.
Mm-hmm.
And then McCormick, I think, predictably up and down as a rookie. Do you view him as a fourth-round pick? Do you view him as a future starter, or is he going to be more of a guy that's, a really good backup? Yeah, that's what you have to figure out. He was thrust into that role this year. I think they like him, but I do think we have to see more from him as well. So to me, the guards are probably the biggest question marks going forward, in addition to whether Broderick Jones can take that next step as well.
Agreed entirely. The other big question that came out of that Mike Tomlin press conference was the situation around George Pickens. Mike Tomlin, naturally wouldn't commit to anyone as far as extension wise, but I thought it was interesting how he talked about it and acknowledged that there were things that George Pickens had to grow up on, including a report that talked about George Pickens being late for a game. We'll talk about all of that, those factors, and what we saw as far as George Pickens, the Steelers offense, and more about what they're doing here next on the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, I want to remind you, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in an accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates have helped injury victims answer that very question. Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people answer the question, what's next? Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about the George Pickens situation now. George Pickens, as we know, a bit of antics throughout the years, not blocking in certain situations, people questioning about his commitment in practice and things like that. And then Mike Tomlin gets asked yesterday at the end of yesterday's press conference about a report about George Pickens being late to the Christmas Day game against the Chiefs. And Mike Tomlin doesn't deny it. He says he had a lot going on during pregame. But as much as that answer, kind of trying to, dodge a bullet there. I think it's interesting that's brought up and that the report is brought up, because if you remember at the end of that game, George Pickens was one of the guys was yelling on the field about how the Steelers weren't getting it together on offense. And this was the year for George Pickens to kind of disprove all the notions and narratives about how he doesn't have the composure to be the number one guy. He's not focused enough. He's not mature enough. And he did not beat those allegations this year. Like those are still now big major questions heading into what is his this was the year to kind of prove it. And now this is his final year of his rookie deal. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on the Steelers front office to figure out what's the plan for George Pickens, because do you want to commit to him long-term when this has still been an issue for 3 years, Ray? Or do you need to find a way to move him and get some compensation for him before you just end up losing him to free agency?
Yeah, to me, there's three avenues that they can go, Chris, and really only two. I don't think they want to go down the road of an extension, but you could, they could decide to do that, extend him, sign him to a new contract, or more likely trade him either when the new league year begins in March or at the draft, or you just let him play out his rookie contract. And I think we all know that that would be a slippery slope if they decided to do that. I mean, Chris, when you look at it, if you're Omar Khan or even Mike Tomlin or Zach Azzani or Arthur Smith, how can you feel good about giving that guy an extension?
Not when you want to build your new team around people that are fully buying in, that you don't have to chase after. And when Mike Tomlin has to continue, because like Mike Tomlin's addressed George Pickens several times before, we've seen it. But at the same time, you can't reward the guy that doesn't get the message after several times of being corrected.
I think it would send a terrible message to the team. And here's the dilemma for the Steelers: whether they do that deal or not, you have to go out and spend money on a really good receiver in free agency.
Yep.
You have to, because you can't rely on the draft. I mean, look what happened with Roman Wilson this year. I know he wasn't a second or third round pick, first or second round pick, but he was a third round pick.
Yep.
And a lot of times rookies just don't. Some guys just don't get it right away. It's hard to step into the National Football League and be a guy who puts up big numbers. It just doesn't happen very often unless you're put into a really good situation. So, I'm sure we'll talk about T. Higgins in the coming weeks and months. There's probably some other receivers who are going to be out there, but whether it's George or a guy like T. Higgins, you're going to have to commit, 25, 30 million a year to go out and get a really good receiver to help your offense. And that doesn't even include draft resources, getting a guy in the first round, second round, to help as well. So it's talk about the salary cap and what you're going to have to do. To me, you just earmark right now, 25, 30 million a year over like 3 or 4 years to go out and get yourself a guy that you can depend on in the future.
No, I agree. That's got to be something that you're considering right now. And like you said, whether or not you keep George Pickens, that's got to be a factor there. But like, here's the other thing. If you put George Pickens on a trade market and you try to get some compensation, maybe that can help you as far as your return. If you can get back, you got a second round for Chase Claypool. Maybe you can get another second rounder for George Pickens. And granted, I think that people might be starting to be wise. Like, hey, whenever the Steelers are trading away a wide receiver, maybe we should be wary about that, considering Deontay Johnson is now just got cut from his fourth team. But
maybe they need to start scouting receivers better. My goodness. I mean, these guys they can't even stay in the league. Chase Claypool's
out. Like certain guys are different. Like, Antonio Brown, like, was one of the greatest receivers of the generation and just went crazy at the end. Juju Smith-Schuster got hurt, and that kind of changed his trajectory of his career, but guys like Deontay Johnson who can't stay on a team. And now there's reports out about how, like, during the Texans playoff win in the locker room, he was like visibly upset and players trying to calm him down because he felt he wasn't involved enough in the game plan to win. Like, it makes it amazing that, like, there weren't worse things that happened while Deontay Johnson was with the Steelers, as far as things that got out from what was going on there. And then so you compile that with Claypool. Yeah, maybe it does mean that the Steelers need to go less for the types that are high maintenance wide receivers. Go for the guys that are, hey, they're going to be, sure, all receivers are divas at some point. Like, Jamar Chase has been a guy who's made some comments, but because because he has Joe Burrow, he feels a lot better about it and he doesn't have to do that. But if Jamar Chase was on a team with, if he was on the team with Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph, how would he have dealt with that in his time in Pittsburgh? I think that's something that teams got to consider all the time, but they need a better leader in their wide receiver room, and they haven't had one in such a long time.
Hey, listen, this is going to be a big topic for us in the coming weeks and months once we really ramp up our draft coverage. But I think it's probably time to stop talking about the Steelers being really good at drafting receivers. That was like a Kevin Colbert type thing in the 2000s and early 2010s and teens. That's not the case now.
Right.
They have not drafted and developed receivers well. And like your point about divas, I mean, can you just go out and get like normal guys? Like, I remember Mike Wallace, Emmanuel Sanders, like guys who came in like 09 and 10. They eventually left for free agency because they had better opportunities and Antonio Brown was here, but like, they didn't cause all kinds of problems in the locker room. It wasn't like, it wasn't like they were cancers or anything like that. So just, get some guys in here, guys that your scouts can feel comfortable with, guys who aren't problems. And I think that'll be a big step forward, but we could talk about that in February and March. So
we certainly can, but we want to keep talking about this offense because we've talked a lot about the defense and their shortcomings. We talked about certain coaches that the Steelers might need to move on from, like Terrell Austin or Pat Meyer. But we got to talk about the offensive coordinator because he's just in the first year of his new deal and he just got to the team. And listen, he rose up the Steelers offense from, again, the bottom of the league to the middle of the league, which I thought was a reasonable goal to achieve. However, there were certainly a lot of shortcomings that came with the offense. And I think we should talk a little bit more about the future of this team with Arthur Smith and what might happen there and what might need to happen there if he wants to stay longer. We'll talk about that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you the show is brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can go get your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or visit their website, moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
It's that time of year again to get the Honda of your dreams during Happy Honda Days, where you'll find great offers on a sporty new Civic, spirited accord, fun to drive HRV, and versatile CRV. So don't wait. Turn your holiday dreams into reality with a new Honda named KBB.com's best value brand. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about the offensive coordinator. Now, Mike Tomlin did acknowledge that, there were certain things that the Steelers did well, things they need to do better. But what's your read on where Arthur Smith stands? Because, I feel like, yes, there were certain things that didn't work. Like everyone wondered, why did they keep calling pitches when they obviously didn't work in the offense? There were certain things that weren't leaned upon enough, maybe at certain times. But when you look at how the offensive line didn't develop as a unit, when they had they had injuries there, the run game wasn't there, and that was supposed to be what Arthur Smith did well. He was going to bring a power run offense that could set up play action, and it felt like neither were really a threat at the end of the season. They were at one point in the middle part of the season, but where do you see this team standing with Arthur Smith right now?
Yeah, listen, Arthur Smith has 2 years left on his contract. Unless he gets one of those head coaching gigs, he's going to be back next season. And I think if things unfold differently, that they can even take a bigger step next season. Probably a victim of circumstance, right? Not only is your offensive line banged up this year, but they're young. And I think Mike Tomlin talked about it yesterday, Chris. What did he say? They were mentally and physically fatigued by the end of the season. And no one acknowledges that when the season is going on. But the rookie wall is a very real thing in the NFL. So guys like Mason McCormick, Zach Frazier, maybe they were worn down a little bit by season's end. So that's certainly one factor. If your offensive line doesn't play well, your offense isn't going to play well. And as you mentioned, that's the linchpin to Arthur Smith's offenses. You need a good, strong front line, and they didn't have that this season. And I'm not making excuses for Art, but
no,
he was handed a receivers room that I would venture to say was definitely bottom third in the NFL. They didn't go out and get a number 2 receiver for him. So he had some challenges. But I also think, and probably I was probably more critical of him than anyone, the personnel packages, right? Like the infatuation with guys like Cordero Patterson, with Michael Pruitt, with Connor Hayward. I think, Pruitt and Patterson were his guys. He wanted those guys here. Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller. He wanted those guys here. To me, it's up to the front office now to sit down with Arthur and say, hey, I understand that you want these types of guys on your offense, but maybe these guys now are a little bit older, maybe washed up a little bit.
Find new versions of that.
Let's go out and get guys like them who are younger and who are better and have more potential. So hopefully that was just a one-off where, the front office kind of appeased him and, brought in like 4 or 5 guys that he was familiar with. That's fine. I get it. But you have to go out and get better players too, because if you just look at that offense, Chris, I mean, other than George Pickens and occasionally Jaylen Warren, who are you afraid of?
Right.
I mean, even Pat Freiermuth, and I've been a big defender of Pat Freiermuth over the years. You watch some of these other playoff games.
Tight ends making plays.
How about Dallas Goedert? Stiff arm.
Trucking people. These other tight ends are making something out of nothing. And, I just have the vision, unfortunately, of one of the last images of Pat Freiermuth. It's catching a pass on 32 and getting 1 yard. I mean, he's got to be better too. And Pat was upfront about that. He says all the young guys, including himself, have to be better. But there's no one on this offense who scares anyone other than George Pickens. Yeah, and I think that's part of the realities here. And again, these aren't excuses for Arthur Smith, but this is part of like, hey, you brought him in to fix things. Now you need to give him time to fix things. And maybe he's leaning. I think that getting some of these new guys that we're talking about are the guys that he brought in, like Skoranek, like Cordero Patterson, like Michael Pruitt. Pretty sure he did that because he sometimes you need guys that you can say like, hey, my system. You know what I'm asking for in this very specific spot. I don't know if there's going to be guys that can do that. And that's fine when you're getting started, right? Like there's time to figure things out. And I also want to remind people, like, good offensive coordinators don't always hit right away. Like Todd Haley was a good offensive coordinator for the Steelers. He got Ben Roethlisberger some of his best statistical years of his career. But when he first got to Pittsburgh, it wasn't all peaches and cream. It was rough. You saw it, Ray, with the way that the offense got started back then. It was tough on them. They struggled for their first 2 years. They were figuring some things out, but then when they found their offensive line developed, Le'Veon Bell got drafted. He became a major factor. Antonio Brown became a superstar. Then all of a sudden there was a rhythm to the offense and there was an identity to the offense. So it takes more than a year, especially when you don't have a franchise quarterback to build around, to find that rhythm. So I think that that's where the Steelers are naturally going to have some patience for Arthur Smith. But I do think that that's part of what his primary objective needs to be, is this offense needs to have an identity. And I think in midseason, we thought it had one. It was running the ball and playing play action pass and Russell Wilson hitting deep balls and that kind of balance, making it tough for defenses to guess where the Steelers were going to go. But in the last 5 games of the season, that was not anything that anyone had to be afraid of. Maybe some of that was played into by George Pickens missing 3 games and then being late for 1 game and then, not really being a factor in that. Maybe that factored in. Maybe the offensive line, like you said, hitting that mental wall all played a factor into it. But that's going to be the challenge that he's going to be tasked with overcoming next season if he's still with the Steelers. And again, I don't think he's going to be fired just like you don't think he's going to be fired. He's not a guy. He has 2 more years left on his deal. Guys like Terrell Austin, they have like 1 more year on their deal. There's certain things that have to happen there if the Steelers want to figure things out on offense. But I do think that this is going to be a crucial year for him if he doesn't get hired away by it, to be a head coach somewhere, to show like, hey, I still got it. We can still get to where I talked about us getting to. We just need to fine tuning some things. It also, certainly would help if the resources they drafted were available to him, like Troy Fautano and Roman Wilson in that picture.
Yeah. And I think people don't want to have patience. And I think part of it is, there was that mandate by Art Rooney that they had to get to the playoffs this year, and people expected the offense to be better, and it was better. But I think those increments come maybe in baby steps rather than giant steps. And I think you go back to what just his foundation as a coach, right, in Tennessee, the guys he worked for. He worked for Wisenhunt, Malarkey, Vrabel, and when Arthur got that opportunity, the team was really built. You had Derrick Henry and you had A.J. Brown, and certainly had better pieces, but he knew what to do with those pieces when he had it. So Art Rooney sees the big picture. I think Omar and Mike will see the big picture too. I think, they're obviously, he's under contract. They're obviously going to give him another shot to come back. I think you just have to build around him, get the types of players he needs in here. And then hopefully, the linchpin, obviously with any team, and Andy and Omar know this, is the offensive line. The offensive line has to come around. If it doesn't, it's not going to work. So you need guys like Broderick Jones to pan out, Troy Fautano to pan out. Those high picks that you invested, they have to start playing better and getting on the field. And I think if that happens, I do think you'll see the line play better.
Certainly a big thing that they have to make sure that comes to fruition. We will see how Arthur Smith progresses. We'll also see what other changes happen. We talked about the potential moving on from Pat Meyer as offensive line coach. We talked about, changes on defense. What changes will the Steelers make? Typically, they happen shortly after this Mike Tomlin press conference. So be on the lookout throughout the week. You can get all that information from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com, where you can read all the work from Ray Fittipaldo, Jerry Dulac, all of our colleagues here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll be back Friday with Brian Batko here on the North Shore Drive broadcast, down, focusing more on what the Steelers are doing, any further news we've seen, and getting you ready for the weekend as the playoffs continue here in the NFL. Keep it here with the North Shore Drive podcast. Subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. You can get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday shows of the North Shore Drive podcast on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get those and all of our daily content from the Post-Gazette sports writers. We'll see you here on the North Shore Drive podcast on Friday. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.